The date is March 5th, 1776. The sun rises over Boston Harbor, and British General William Howe steps out of his quarters to look at the hills above the city. He stops. He looks again. On Dorchester Heights, the high ground that towers over the entire British position, a fortress has appeared. Overnight, cannons, earthworks, hundreds of men, guns big enough to drop iron balls straight down on his army and his fleet in the harbor below. Howe will later say it would have taken his entire force 3 months to build what the Americans built in a single night. One of his own officers writes that the rebels did more work in 12 hours than his army could have done in 3 weeks. Howe has a choice: storm the heights, lose half his army, maybe keep the city, or run. He runs. 11 days later, on March 17, 1776, the British Army, the most powerful military force on Earth, boards its ships and abandons Boston. The 13 colonies have won their first major victory. The siege is broken. The revolution survives its first winter, and it happened because of 59 cannons that should not have been there. Those guns were sitting 297 miles away in a crumbling fort on the edge of the Canadian wilderness. To get them to Boston in time, somebody had to drag 60 tons of iron and bronze across frozen lakes, over the Berkshire Mountains, through snowstorms, in the dead of winter in 1775. The man George Washington sent to do it was 25 years old. He had never commanded a soldier. He had never fired a cannon in combat. He weighed nearly 300 pounds. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a hunting accident.
I believe this volume contains the maps you require.
This is the story of Henry Knox, the man who learned how to win a war by reading the books he sold to British officers, and who pulled off one of the most audacious logistical feats in military history before he was old enough to legally drink in most American states today. Henry Knox was born in Boston on July 25, 1750. He was the 7th of 10 children born to William and Mary Knox. When Henry was 9 years old, his father went bankrupt, abandoned the family, and sailed for the West Indies, where he died 3 years later. Henry never saw him again. At 12 years old, with his mother destitute and 4 younger brothers to feed, Henry left grammar school and walked into a bookshop owned by a man named Wharton and Bowes. He asked for a job. He got one. For the next 9 years, Henry Knox lived inside books. He swept the shop, bound the volumes, he carried orders to customers, and in every spare moment, he read. He read history, he read mathematics, he read the classics. But what he loved most, what he could not put down, were books on military science, manuals on artillery, treatises on fortification. He taught himself French specifically so he could read military texts that had not yet been translated into English. In 1771, at the age of 21, Knox opened his own shop. He called it the London Bookstore. It sat on Cornhill Street in Boston, and it became one of the most fashionable bookshops in the city. British officers stationed in Boston loved it. They walked in by the dozen, ordering the latest titles from London, chatting with the polite young proprietor, never realizing that the friendly fat man behind the counter was studying everything they said, listening to every detail about gun crews and powder ratios and field tactics. He had also, by this point, watched something he would never forget. On the night of March 5th, 1770, exactly 6 years to the day before he would change history, Henry Knox stood on King Street in Boston and tried, with his bare hands, to stop a British officer from ordering his soldiers to fire on a crowd of civilians. He grabbed the officer's coat. He begged him to hold the line. The officer pulled away. The shots rang out. 5 colonists died. The Boston Massacre. Some men watch a thing like that and decide it is not their problem. Henry Knox decided it was the only problem that mattered. In 1774, he married Lucy Flucker, the daughter of the Royal Secretary of Massachusetts. Her family was as loyalist as a family could be. They begged her not to marry the bookseller. She did it anyway. And when the war came, she chose her husband over her family. She would never see most of them again. They sailed for England in 1776 and never came back. By April of 1775, when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, Knox was 24 years old, a self-taught military theorist with no military experience whatsoever, and he was about to walk away from the only life he had ever built. He smuggled his wife out of British-occupied Boston with his sword sewn into the lining of her cloak. He left his bookshop behind. He never reopened it.
By the autumn of 1775, the situation outside Boston was a catastrophe waiting to happen. George Washington had taken command of the Continental Army in July. He had inherited roughly 16,000 men camped in a ring around the British garrison in the city. On paper, the Americans had the British surrounded. In reality, the Americans could do nothing about it. They had muskets, but no heavy guns. They could not bombard the city, they could not threaten the harbor, they could not force a battle. All they could do was sit there and wait. The British, meanwhile, could be reinforced by sea at any moment. Every week that passed brought the possibility of fresh troops, fresh supplies, fresh disaster. Washington knew that if he did not break the siege before spring, the British would break it for him, and the war might end before it started. The Americans desperately needed artillery, and the only place to get it was Fort Ticonderoga, a captured British fortress on the southern end of Lake Champlain near the border with Canada. American forces under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had seized it back in May, along with a treasure trove of cannons, mortars, and howitzers. The guns were sitting there unused, 300 miles away, across some of the most rugged terrain in North America. 300 miles. In winter, through forests, over rivers, across mountains. Anyone with military experience would have called the idea impossible. Henry Knox volunteered. He had met Washington only a few weeks earlier. The two men had liked each other immediately. Washington, the tall, reserved Virginian, and Knox, the booming, jovial, encyclopedically read young Bostonian who could quote any campaign in European history from memory. When Knox laid out his plan, Washington did something almost no general in the 18th century would have done. He listened to the 25-year-old bookseller, and then he gave him the job. On November 16, 1775, Washington wrote orders giving Henry Knox the authority to retrieve every gun, every barrel of powder, and every pound of shot he could move from Fort Ticonderoga to the army outside Boston. Knox had never commanded so much as a wagon train. He had a brother, William, age 19, to help him. He had a few hundred pounds in Continental currency, which was already losing its value. He had no soldiers, no teamsters, no oxen, no sleds, and no plan beyond what he had read in books. He set out anyway. Knox reached Fort Ticonderoga on December 5th, 1775. The fort itself was a wreck. The walls were crumbling, the garrison was a few dozen men in rags, but the guns were there. And there were more of them than anyone in the army had realized. Knox spent days inventorying the artillery. By the time he was finished, he had selected 59 pieces. Cannons firing balls from 3 pounds to 24 pounds, howitzers, mortars, including a massive bronze mortar the soldiers nicknamed Old Sow for its enormous size. Together, the guns weighed roughly 120,000 pounds. 60 tons of metal. Knox wrote to Washington with cheerful confidence. He thought he could have the guns in Cambridge in 17 days. He was off by about 6 weeks. The first leg of the journey was water. Knox had to move the guns 30 miles south down Lake George before winter froze the lake solid. He scrambled to find boats. He pressed a battered sailing scow and a long, flat-bottomed boat called a gundalo into service.
They loaded the guns by hand, with ropes and levers and the muscle of every man Knox could hire.
On December 9th, they pushed off into the lake. The gondola promptly hit a submerged rock and sank. Knox stood on the shore and watched several tons of cannon disappear beneath the surface of Lake George. Most men would have given up there. Knox got the guns back. He found local crews, refloated the boat, salvaged everything, and kept moving. 5 days later, the guns reached the southern end of the lake. Now the real problem started. From here on, there was no water. There were only roads, if you could call them roads. Cart tracks, mostly. Frozen mud, forests, mountain passes, and there were no wagons in the world strong enough to carry a 24-pounder cannon over those roads. Knox needed snow. Without snow, he could not use sleds. Without sleds, he could not move the guns. He sat at Fort George waiting for winter to do its job. And at first, winter refused. The weather stayed warm. Knox wrote frantic letters. He paced, he cursed, and then, on Christmas Day, 1775, it began to snow.
It snowed for 3 days. By December 28th, there were 2 feet of snow on the ground, and Henry Knox had what he needed. Knox had hired teamsters and oxen from the surrounding farms. He had commissioned 42 heavy sleds from local carpenters, built specifically for this purpose. Each sled would be pulled by yokes of oxen, sometimes 6, sometimes 8, sometimes more for the heaviest pieces. When the column finally began to move, it stretched for miles. 42 sleds, 80 oxen, hundreds of men, 60 tons of iron and bronze grinding south through the snow. What happened over the next 6 weeks defies belief. They crossed the Hudson River 4 separate times. The first crossing was at Glen Falls.
Across the ice held. The second crossing nearly killed them. As one of the heaviest cannons rolled out onto the frozen river, the ice cracked under its weight. The cannon broke through, dropping into the freezing water below. Knox did not abandon it. His men cut holes in the ice. They worked with ropes and chains. They pulled an 18-pounder cannon back up out of the Hudson River in the middle of winter by hand and put it back on the sled. A few miles later, another cannon broke through. They pulled that one out too. By the time the column reached the Berkshire Mountains in western Massachusetts, the men were exhausted. The oxen were exhausted, and the worst was still ahead. The Berkshires are not the Rockies, but they were brutal enough. Steep grades, ice-slicked passes, narrow tracks where a sled could slide sideways and pull the oxen down a cliff if anyone made a mistake. They lost no men. They lost a handful of oxen to the cold and the strain. They kept moving. In the towns along the route, people came out to watch the column pass.
They had never seen anything like it.
A fat young man on horseback, his left hand wrapped in a handkerchief to hide his missing fingers, riding back and forth along the line, encouraging the teamsters, checking the loads, paying farmers in increasingly worthless paper money for hay and bread and fresh oxen. He was everywhere at once. He never seemed to sleep. In one Massachusetts town, the locals held a celebration when the cannons arrived. They demanded a demonstration. Knox, in a rare moment of indulgence, loaded one of the smaller guns and fired it into a hillside. The townspeople cheered. Knox got back on his horse and kept moving. On January 25th, 1776, 56 days after he had reached Ticonderoga, Henry Knox rode into Cambridge, Massachusetts, and reported to General Washington. Behind him, strung out on the roads for miles, came 59 guns. Every single one of them. Not one had been lost, not one had been abandoned. He had walked, ridden, and sledded 60 tons of artillery 300 miles across some of the worst terrain on the continent in the middle of one of the worst winters in living memory. He had done it in less than 2 months.
He had done it as a 25-year-old bookseller with no prior military experience. He had done it, and now Washington had an army with teeth.
For the next month, Knox worked with Washington on a plan. The high ground above Boston, Dorchester Heights, was the key to the entire city. Whoever held those hills controlled the harbor. The British had not occupied them because they had no reason to think the Americans could threaten anything from up there. They knew the rebels had no heavy guns. Now, the rebels did. But there was a problem. The ground on Dorchester Heights was frozen solid. Solid enough that digging trenches and earthworks the normal way, which would have taken weeks, was impossible. The Americans needed to put fortifications on those hills in a single night, before the British could see them coming. Because if Howe spotted the operation in progress, he would attack and slaughter the work parties. The plan they came up with was brilliant. Instead of digging into the frozen ground, the Americans would build their fortifications above it. They prefabricated entire walls, heavy wooden frames called chandeliers, packed with bundles of sticks and barrels of dirt in secret locations behind the lines. They built hundreds of them. Then, on the night of March 4th, 1776, they hauled the whole prefabricated fortress, piece by piece, up onto Dorchester Heights in the dark. 3,000 men, hundreds of carts, barrels of dirt to roll down on attackers if the British charged, and the cannons, Knox's cannons, hauled up the hill on the sleds that had brought them from Ticonderoga. They worked all night. To cover the noise, Washington had ordered American batteries on the other side of Boston to bombard the British non-stop. The British thought it was a routine artillery duel. They went to bed. When the sun rose on March 5th, the 6th anniversary, almost to the minute, of the Boston Massacre that Henry Knox had tried to stop, General Howe walked out of his quarters and saw a fortress on the hill that had not been there the day before, with guns aimed at him. He tried to mount a counterattack that night. A storm rolled in and blew his transports off course. He canceled. He thought about it again the next day. He looked at the heights. He looked at his men. He looked at the harbor where his fleet sat under the muzzles of Henry Knox's cannons. He started packing. On March 17, 1776, the British Army and roughly 1,000 loyalist civilians who could not bear to stay under American rule boarded their ships and sailed away from Boston. They left behind food, weapons, and the city itself. The siege was over. The first capital of British military power in North America had fallen without a single American soldier firing a shot from the heights. Bostonians still celebrate March 17th. Most of the country thinks it is just St. Patrick's Day. In Boston, it is Evacuation Day. It is the day Henry Knox's books and Henry Knox's stubbornness and Henry Knox's 60 tons of cannon won America its first real victory. Knox did not stop there. For the rest of the war, he served as Washington's chief of artillery. He was at the crossing of the Delaware in December 1776, his enormous booming voice shouting commands over the ice. He was at Trenton. He was at Princeton. He was at Brandywine, at Germantown, at Monmouth. He spent the brutal winter at Valley Forge alongside Washington and a German named Friedrich von Steuben, who was busy turning the starving Americans into real soldiers, while Knox kept the... He shaped the United States military for a generation. He retired to Maine in 1795. He built an enormous house, ran into financial trouble. Knox was never good with money, and never stopped being generous to a fault, and lived a quieter life with Lucy and their children. Of the 13 children they had together, only 3 survived to adulthood. It was the great grief of his life. Henry Knox died on October 25, 1806, at the age of 56. The cause of death was an infection from swallowing a chicken bone. The man who had outmaneuvered the British Empire, who had pulled cannons out of frozen rivers, who had built the first American army from the ground up, was killed by his
dinner. The British called him an amateur. They called the whole Continental Army a rabble of farmers and shopkeepers, and they were not entirely wrong. The Americans were farmers and shopkeepers. One of those shopkeepers studied them for 10 years before they ever met him, and by the time they figured out who Henry Knox actually was, his guns were on the hill above their fleet, and the war they thought they were winning was already lost. History remembers the men who win battles. It often forgets the people who make those victories possible. If you enjoy stories about the overlooked figures who shaped history, subscribe for more and tell me in the comments, which forgotten hero deserves the next documentary?